Now, one of the things that infuriated the radical Republicans was Lincoln actually rescinded some emancipation orders. In August of 1861, a general in Missouri, John C. Fremont, he actually issued on his own, he was the commander of Union forces in Missouri. He actually freed all the slaves in Missouri on his own. And Lincoln was just furious when Fremont did this for reasons that we've talked a lot about. And so what Lincoln did was is that he ordered Fremont to modify his order. And Fremont's wife came to Washington to talk to Lincoln. She was actually the daughter of a very famous U.S. senator. It's very the 19th century was a very small world. I think a lot of you are familiar with the phrase 6 degrees of separation. There's like 6 degrees of separation between me and any other American, right? Well, in the 19th century, it was only like 2 degrees of separation. It was really a small world. Anyway, Lincoln met Fremont's wife. He was quite rude to her. He was not happy. Ultimately, he fires Fremont and he puts someone else in Fremont's place. And the radicals were really upset that Lincoln had rescinded Fremont's order. A general by the name of David Hunter in South Carolina, somewhat later, he tried the same thing that Fremont did. He tried to free the slaves in South Carolina, and Lincoln again pulled the plug on that. Now, Lincoln was furious for two reasons. First of all, this was insubordinate on Fremont's part and Hunter's part. Fremont probably was actually trying to angle for political office. You might remember that it was Fremont who had been the first Republican candidate for president in 1856. Don't ever forget how close politics are to the Army. There's usually a political agenda. It's one of the things I like about Grant, by the way. During the Civil War, he had no political agenda. Anyway, so Fremont's probably angling for the 1864 nomination for president. So there's a bunch of stuff going on. The point is that it's insubordinate, and then of course Lincoln's worried about Kentucky and Missouri, and so he fires the generals that try to free the slaves in their areas, and the radicals are very, very upset with him. It's very hard in 2016 to think of Lincoln being criticized, right? Because Lincoln always seems to be, he seems to be right. He's got kind of a halo around him. But you know what? He could be controversial. He could make mistakes. I'm not quite sure that the firing of these two generals was a mistake. I think they probably moved a little bit too soon, and I think especially Fremont had their own kind of political agenda. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is radicals were very, very frustrated with Lincoln. People like Frederick Douglass, a great African-American leader, he's frustrated with Abraham Lincoln as well. So this is all going on in, the late summer, early fall of the 1861, the first year of the war. But as I've talked about a lot, the events of 1862 start changing people's minds, and the country evolves in almost an incredibly rapid fashion. And the white North in particular, and frankly that's all that really mattered at this point, white Northerners moved in favor of emancipation, or at least enough white Northerners. There was always a pretty good percentage of white Northerners, maybe up to 40%, that opposed emancipation. But enough of the white North moved in the direction of emancipation as the war moved into its second year in 1862. Abolitionists had been despised before the Civil War. Some abolitionists had been murdered. I can't tell you how radical abolitionists seemed before the Civil War. Lincoln didn't like abolitionists. He thought they were crazy. He thought they were nuts because, they wanted to bring on a race war. They didn't care what happened. They just, their goal was just emancipation. But what happens is that by early 1862, abolitionists, they gained a kind of a cachet. They gained a sort of a favor, really for the first time in their history, in the white North. And a New York Times reporter went to an abolitionist convention in Massachusetts, and he's talked very sympathetically about what was going on, that there were African Americans and whites at this convention. Um, and he wrote, peculiar circumstances, i.e. the Civil War, have given the abolitionist meetings an importance that hitherto has not been theirs. So what we're seeing here is, again, this movement. And what we now know, or now what we now understand, is that at least a majority of white Southerners realize that the South can't be defeated without the destruction of slavery. It wasn't vindictive. It wasn't like Northerners were trying to start a race war. It was just a fact. The slavery was the labor force of the South. By freeing the slaves, the North could convert the labor of slaves from the South to the Union Army, so it was kind of a 2-for-1 in that regard. And Northern soldiers had realized this almost from the very instant that the war started. And there is, though, an ideological tinge to emancipation as well, although I have to say most Union soldiers support emancipation on military grounds, not on moral grounds. But nonetheless, there is this sense that the war has to stand for something. And this is what Doyle talks about. This is what Garibaldi, in the first part of the Doyle book, he calls the war an intestine war. He says, if the war is not about emancipation, it's just another war for territory. And that's not something that European liberals, and if a liberal in the European sense was someone who wanted democracy for European countries where it didn't exist, which was all the European countries, it was like, without emancipation, the war has no higher end, no nobler meaning. Now, for Lincoln, this wasn't true. The higher end, or the noble meaning of the Civil War, was saving the Union, because by saving the Union, you saved a form of democratic government. You saved the most successful democracy on earth. So for Lincoln, the war always had a noble meaning. But more and more, what he decides to do is, although, as we know, saving the Union was always his primary goal, he's able to also bring emancipation into the process of saving the Union, and he adds a moral dimension to the war as well. Although I can't stress enough, something I've said, and you're probably tired of me saying it, but saving the Union was always number one for Lincoln. Emancipation was a means to an end, and I think this is very clear. This was true for most Union soldiers as well, and probably many white Northerners. This is why you still have racism after the Emancipation Proclamation. This is why racism was deeply seated in both the North and the South. So emancipation, and this is something that I've come to understand over time, was not a moral crusade or a moral issue. And what you had was a freeing of slaves, which is very significant, the most significant event in U.S. history, without the ending of racism. You had the freeing of slaves, but racism still very much survived in the United States during and after the Civil War. So we're getting now towards the summer of 1862, and even conservative and moderate Republicans are starting to be open to the idea of emancipation, something they would not have believed just a year previously. Sherman is William Sherman's brother. He wrote, you can form no conception of the change of opinion here as to the Negro question. A Boston paper wrote that the issue of emancipation has gained a terrible intensity. A year ago, men might have faltered at the thought of proceeding to this extremity, but now they are in great measure prepared for it. So what we see, and this is what Lincoln senses, there's this broad change in public opinion. Grant himself wrote that his one desire was to put down the rebellion. I have no hobby or my own beliefs in regard to the Negro, either to affect his freedom or to continue his bondage. But I am using them as teamsters, hospital attendants, company cooks, and so forth, thus saving soldiers to carry the musket. I don't know what is to become of these poor people in the end, but it weakens the enemy to take them from Southerners. So when emancipation comes for most white Northerners, it's very much couched in the question, in the belief that it's a military necessity, and that trumps the moral nature of it as well for most whites, although the moral dimension does still exist, especially to Europeans looking at the Union from the outside, and even for some Northern whites as well. And of course, for African Americans such as Frederick Douglass, this is the primary point of the war. For African Americans, the war is about emancipation, and saving the Union is secondary. But Douglass does recognize that in order for there to be emancipation, the Union has to be saved.